The case of Ashlee Martinson, a tragic tale of abuse and violence. For most of her life, Ashlee Martinson had lived in a home filled with fear and tension. Born in 1997, Ashlee grew up in a family marked by dysfunction, with a mother who was emotionally distant and a stepfather who was increasingly violent. Her mother, Sarah Stewart, married James Thomas Stewart when Ashlee was still very young. At first, Ashlee thought James might be a father figure, someone who could offer the stability and love her biological father had failed to provide. But it didn't take long for her to realize that James was anything but a protector. James Stewart was abusive. Ashlee would later testify that James physically and emotionally tormented both her and her mother. Neighbors and friends would recall seeing Ashlee in the yard, looking down, avoiding eye contact, or flinching at the slightest noise. Teachers at her school began to notice the bruises on her arms and the dark circles under her eyes. Ashlee's body language spoke volumes about the pain she was trying to hide, but her mother, Sarah, never stepped in to protect her. Instead, Sarah would often defend James, dismissing the abuse or saying nothing at all. Ashlee would later describe how her stepfather would frequently threaten her, verbally belittle her, and punish her for the smallest infractions. His temper would flare, and Ashlee learned quickly that any misstep could lead to violence. The feeling of being constantly on edge, always expecting an outburst from James, wore on Ashlee's mental and emotional well-being. She started running away from home, seeking refuge in the homes of friends or spending time in the woods near their property just to escape the oppressive atmosphere of her household. But it wasn't just the fear of physical harm. There was a deep psychological torment as well. James seemed to delight in making Ashlee feel powerless, stripping her of her confidence and sense of self-worth. At school, she struggled to focus, her grades slipped, and she withdrew into herself. Yet, no one ever truly saw the depth of her suffering. She kept most of her pain hidden, bottling it up as best as she could. It was February 18, 2015, when Ashlee's world finally shattered. That evening, things had reached a boiling point. The tension in the house had been building for weeks, and that night, the storm finally broke. James had been drinking heavily, as he often did when he became irritable. Ashlee was in her room, trying to escape the sounds of her mother's and stepfather's angry voices. But no matter how hard she tried to shut it out, the yelling only grew louder. It was as if James was always looking for a reason to lash out. Sarah, her mother, was passive, trying to calm the situation, but her efforts were futile. She was complicit in James' reign of terror, and Ashlee knew that her mother was never going to intervene to stop the abuse. Ashlee had been living with this constant fear for years, but tonight felt different. It felt like the violence was closing in on her, and she feared that if she didn't act, she might be the next target. In her mind, she had no escape, no one would help her, and the abuse had reached a breaking point. She went to the closet and found the gun that James kept hidden away. It was a .22 caliber pistol, the very weapon James had used in the past to intimidate others. Over time, Ashlee had become familiar with the gun. She had watched James load it, clean it, and take it out for target practice. In some twisted way, she had come to understand the power it held. Ashlee's heart pounded as she picked up the weapon. It was cold, heavy in her hands, and it gave her a sense of control, something she hadn't felt in years. At some point, the yelling became more than Ashlee could bear. She could hear James shouting at her mother again. He was threatening them both, and Ashlee had reached the limit of what she could tolerate. She crept out of her room, gun in hand. The weight of her decision felt crushing, but there was no turning back. James turned toward her when she entered the living room. His eyes were bloodshot, his words slurred from the alcohol, and his face twisted with rage. He barely saw Ashlee as a threat, she was just another target for his wrath. He raised his voice, demanding she stay out of it. The first shot rang out in the silence of the house. James collapsed to the floor, a look of shock on his face, blood pooling around him. Ashlee didn't hesitate, she turned the gun on her mother, who had stepped forward in a panic, trying to help James or stop the chaos. Ashlee fired again. Sarah fell to the ground, her body lifeless. The moment passed in a blur. Ashlee stood in the middle of the living room, frozen, staring at the two bodies sprawled before her. The reality of what she had done was overwhelming, but there was no time to process it. She grabbed her things and fled the house, running into the cold Alaskan night. Ashlee didn't know what to do next. For the next few days, she went into hiding. She wandered through the woods, feeling the weight of what she had done, but at the same time, a part of her felt numb. She didn't know where to go or who to turn to. She was alone, and the people who had been her family were gone. Eventually, Ashlee reached out to a friend, asking for help. Her friend drove her to the airport, where Ashlee planned to board a flight to Texas, hoping to escape the consequences of her actions. But law enforcement had already begun tracking her, and within hours, they apprehended her at the airport. Ashlee was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She had acted alone, and she didn't try to hide the truth. During her time in custody, she spoke openly about the abuse she had suffered. She told authorities about the years of torment, the constant fear, and how, in that moment, she had felt that her only way out was through violence. Ashlee's trial began in 2016, and it quickly became a spectacle, drawing attention to the complex nature of her crime. The defense team argued that Ashlee had been pushed to the brink by years of abuse and had acted out of self-defense. They presented testimony from friends, teachers, and neighbors who had witnessed James' violent behavior. Ashlee's own statements about the psychological and physical abuse she had suffered painted a picture of a young girl pushed to the edge of her endurance. Investigators uncovered text messages between Ashlee and her friends, in which she expressed her fear of James and her desire to escape. These messages, combined with the testimony from those who knew her, painted a troubling portrait of a teenager trapped in a cycle of abuse with no way out. However, the prosecution countered that while the abuse was undeniable, Ashlee's actions that night were not an act of self-defense. They argued that she had planned the murders, retrieved the gun, and shot both her mother and stepfather in quick succession, suggesting premeditation. The prosecution pointed out that Ashlee had fled the scene immediately afterward and attempted to escape the state, which they saw as an indication of guilt. In the end, Ashlee Martinson pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 45 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The case sparked intense debate about the nature of justice for young offenders, particularly in cases where abuse is a significant factor. Some saw Ashlee as a victim of a brutal system, trapped in an impossible situation. Others believed that the gravity of taking 2 lives could not be overlooked. Ashlee's case remains one of the most talked about cases in the conversation around domestic violence and juvenile justice. Her story is a tragic reminder of the toll that years of abuse can take on a young person, and the devastating consequences of a broken system that fails to protect them. Ashlee Martinson's story is a complex and heart-wrenching one. Her actions were undeniably extreme, but they were born from a life of constant torment and fear. She became a victim of violence herself, trapped in a cycle that ultimately led to tragedy. In her eyes, the murder was the only escape. For many, her case is a painful reminder of the importance of addressing abuse before it reaches the breaking point. Her story raises essential questions about how society responds to the suffering of vulnerable children and the responsibility of adults to protect them. It is a tale of a broken family, an abused child, and the irreversible consequences of a life lived in fear.